The first attempt at Resident Evil 4 started a little bit after the second game hit the market, and it was going to be the first Resident Evil title for the PlayStation 2. However, that game soon became very different from its predecessors in the survivor horror genre in general, but instead of scrapping the idea, the premise was changed and Capcom created yet another franchise, Devil May Cry. In 2001, Resident Evil 4 got new life as part of the agreement between Nintendo and Capcom that saw a remake of the first game as well as a prequel starring Rebecca Chambers of Bravo Team hit the market. But that is for later on in this retrospective. After it was announced, Resident Evil 4 went through a few prototypes before the final version was made. The first one saw Leon invading the Umbrella headquarters and fighting these fog-like creatures, as well as exploring more about the virus from which the T-virus was made. The next version has been dubbed by fans the Hooked Man version because one of the enemies in the shown footage is a man with a hook on his wrists. Many elements from this version were carried over into the final game, such as perspective, laser sight, struggles with enemies, and grenades. It was cancelled for being too paranormal. Even when the final version of the game was made, many Capcom producers felt Resident Evil 4 was too risky a departure from the series, but even so, that doesn't make it a bad game. The reverse is true. When the game was ported to PlayStation 2, a new side story starring Ada Wong was inserted called Separate Ways. It details what Ada was doing during the events of the game and explains some of the things that happened, such as the church bell ringing. One thing I have to say about this game is that overall I found it a lot harder than any of the previous ones I had played, and it's mostly because of the new enemies. The further into the game you got, the harder the grunts got. The Ganados only used knives and pitchforks and other stabbing weapons, and could be dealt with easily. The Zealots used crossbows as well as bladed weapons, and the handgun was basically useless against them. When you got to the militia, they had tasers and guns. Yes, guns. After going through all of this, President Graham better be grateful you rescued his daughter, especially considering how many times she gets her ass captured. Now, before Resident Evil 4, we got Resident Evil 0. Like I said earlier, it chronicled Rebecca Chambers' exploits when Bravo Team was sent to investigate a derailed train in the Arklay Mountains, only to discover zombies. Wesker and Birkins have behind-the-scenes roles, showing that they knew Umbrella was screwed now that the T-Virus had escaped from one of their facilities. We also meet a new character named Billy Cohen, who is an ex-military guy who is about to be executed, but his escort service gets derailed by the virus escaping. Since I never played the game, there's not much else I can tell you about it, but if you've ever wondered about how the mansion incident happened, this is the game for you. The remake of Part 1 came out around this time as well, and unlike the original version, this is one I played all the way through. There are a lot of differences besides an update on graphics and the redesign of the mansion, one being Lisa Trevor and her father's subplot being reinserted into the game. Overall, from what I've researched, the game is about 75 to 80% different than the original, give or take. And for those who've beaten the first one to death, you should give it a play if only to hear better voice acting. I can't believe that sandwich line.
After years of development, Resident Evil 5 was released in 2009. Even before the release date, some people were complaining about racist undertones, mostly stemming from Chris being white and most of the enemies being black. Personally, I view this complaint as unwarranted nitpicking, especially once Sheva is factored in. Some even went a step further and complained that she wasn't dark enough, which is really a stretch. The game takes place a few years after Resident Evil 4. Wesker has managed to get his hands on a sample of Las Plagas and has mutated it into something called Ouroboros. Its victims suffer the same fate as the Ganados, but are faster and stronger. Most of the game is spent tracking down Wesker and a few associates before facing the man himself. And boy, is his boss battle hard. He can dodge bullets Matrix style, and one of the few ways to score a hit is to surprise him. One early plot moment involves Jill having died during a mission several years earlier, but later on we find out she survived and is working for Wesker via a mind control device on her chest. One level involves trying to remove the device, and you have to be careful with your aim or she dies. I first played the game on co-op with my brother, so I didn't notice some of the minor issues with the gameplay. It was only when I did my first solo run-through that they came to the surface. For starters, you can't hold as many items as before, and there's no option to buy more space. While the second character balances this out slightly, Sheva can use up all your resources while in a tight spot, which adds to the difficulty of later stages. While this is annoying, I don't fault Capcom for trying something new with gameplay. It's just the execution. While Resident Evil 5 was both a critical and financial success, it didn't score as high as its predecessors. In my opinion, this is partially due to the game going in a more action-horror direction. The survival element is still there, but it isn't as horrific as the previous games, and in one case a little silly. Despite this, I enjoyed the game and looked forward to the next one.
In 2007, Capcom released its first Resident Evil game for the Nintendo Wii, and it was a mix of something old and new. Like Survivor, Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles had a first-person camera, but unlike that game, instead of moving around at will, you went through the game on a rail, reminiscent of some arcade games. The story of the game is simple. It retells the events of Resident Evil 0, 1, and 3 by condensing the stories and eliminating the puzzle-solving elements. Capcom also included some new stories that expanded a little bit on the universe. We find out how the hell Wesker escaped from the mansion at the end of Part 1, and we also find out how Ada escaped from Raccoon City. And let's not forget, we once again get to play as the mysterious umbrella mercenary Hunk. And there's also a few other things, introducing a new character who works at Umbrella in a secret facility in Russia.
2009 gave us a sequel, The Dark Side Chronicles.
Like the first one, it was a mix of old and new. The old in this case being a retelling of Resident Evil 2 and Code Veronica. The new story shows a mission that Leon and Krauser went on in 2002. This not only expands a little bit on what happened right when Umbrella was considered dead, but shows why Krauser decided to work for Wesker during the events of Part 4.
While I wouldn't say these are my favorite games in the series, they are enjoyable to play. Capcom retold the games with an interesting twist while improving the gameplay with the sequel. While I haven't had the chance just yet, they are the perfect Resident Evil games to play with a friend. Operation Raccoon City was the next major spin-off. A what-if story set during the events of the viral outbreak. The plot centered on a group of Umbrella Security Service soldiers who are stranded in the city following Hunk's mission to retrieve the G-Virus samples. Over the course of the game, they interact with characters such as Nikolai, Claire, Leon, and even Nemesis himself. While the game is fun, it has its share of issues. Parts of the game are harder than necessary, and the gameplay feels like third-person Call of Duty at times. While these can be dealt with given enough playtime, the what-if story aspect is the big disappointment for me. When I first read about the game in Game Informer, I pictured a game where you'd be moving through the city, interacting with familiar characters, like designating parts of the story, and making decisions that determine how the story continues, creating different story paths, and giving more incentive for multiple playthroughs. In practice, the only major decision the player gets to make is whether he or she betrays Umbrella. While this disappointment has waned since the game came out, and I do appreciate it for what it is, I consider it a missed opportunity. Resident Evil Revelations was another crack at a handheld spin-off, as well as a return to the series' survival horror roots. The entry was so successful that it was ported to the main consoles and received a sequel. As of now, I've only played the first few missions, and from what I've seen, I can say the game is enjoyable. While I did give up early on, it was mainly from a combination of not playing the game for a few weeks, combined with the controls having a different feel from 4 and 5, which, considering its handheld roots, is to be expected. When I first edited this retrospective together, another main entry in the series hadn't been confirmed, and speculation was ripe about what direction the series would be heading in. Part of that speculation was answered in 2012 when Capcom released a trailer for Resident Evil 6, which was to be released later that year. Like with the previous entry, I was excited. Not only was the series going forward, but a lot of the main characters would be included, and they would interact. Like a lot of fans, I first thought that the female in the trailer was Ashley from Part 4, but it turned out to be Sherry Birkin, who hasn't been seen since Part 2. Without saying a lot, age has certainly improved her character. Like Leon and Chris, Sherry has a partner, a man named Jake who turns out to be Wesker's son. While this revelation comes out of nowhere, I personally have no issue with it. While pre-Resident Evil 5 Wesker doesn't seem like the type of man who'd settle down and raise a family, I can still see him fathering a child without attachment. Like the Chronicles series, the game contains multiple stories that the player must complete, and each has a different feel. Leon's is more akin in tone to Resident Evil 4, although scaled up at points. Chris's story is like Resident Evil 5, with a handful of horror moments and action moments. Sherry and Jake's story is a balance of the two, although parts near the end lean more towards action. Ada's story is what you would expect for her, and it gives more insight into a plot point from Leon and Chris's. From a control standpoint, it plays like its predecessors, with minor tweaks like walk shooting and a slide function. The only change I wasn't a big fan of was the knife once again having to be equipped to be used. It adds to both the challenge and the frustration. The game was released, I played through each story, and I enjoyed it. While I didn't notice it at first, like its predecessor, 6 was polarizing amongst fans and critics alike. While I can understand some of the complaints, as there are a few moments that frustrated me, I find it a little hard to see how the game is that polarizing. Perhaps a second playthrough in the future will open my eyes a little, but from what I remember the game is an improvement over Part 5, especially when it comes to the partner and items dynamics.